Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Hello, welcome. Today is Wednesday, February 3rd of 2021-ish, I guess, maybe 2020 extra time, but 2021. This is the InfoMullet Live, Ask Me Anything. I am your Chief Mulleteer, Timothy Clancy, and this is Bonky, the Emotional Support Donkey. We will discuss some rather upsetting topics today. I mean, there's clearly a lot of angst, trauma, anger, frustration, and these are all very valid, but that's just GameStop. In addition to that, we're going to be talking about insurrection and conflict. So we've got the Emotional Support Donkey if you need him. He'll be kind of quiet, but it's really more of a presence thing. So to get started, the title of this episode, the 17% threshold effect, comes from an effect I've described a lot of times on the InfoMullet. And I actually discussed it before the elections when I did my forecasts on post-election mass violence and instability. And the 17% threshold effect is kind of a notional number. It's not a hard number. You can't go out in an article and find this as science, but it's a notional number that's the difference between the risk of clandestine terror networks morphing into what an insurgency, and we'll get in when we get into the deconflicting the conflict terms, we'll get into a little bit more what the difference is between those. But the 17% threshold effect, what that means is if someone is planning an act, let's say they want to plan a bombing, right? The 17% threshold effect says if that group has either popular support or intimidation of the population, that 17 people out of 100 who know about that act being planned, but don't tell the police about it, you have an insurgency. There's enough popular support, you have an insurgency. If the bomb goes off and people recognize the picture that's taken from a camera and 17 out of 100 people recognize that person but don't say anything, that's where you get between the difference between a clandestine terror group and an insurgency. And the reason that the reason we call it clandestine terror group is below that 17% threshold effect, you're having to hide everything you do, not just from the law enforcement, but from everyone around you, your neighbors, your family, your friends. You're having to act in a clandestine way. And it's very difficult, very resource intensive. It's why terror groups struggle, and they are really limited in the impact they can have in the law. I mean, they can generate a lot of terror, they can generate a lot of fear, but they're not as effective because they have to spend enormous amounts of resources to hide from the law enforcement. However, once you cross that threshold, and it's a notional threshold, enough people are either supporting you, they agree with what you're doing, or they're intimidated by you that they won't go to the authorities. And maybe the authorities are part of that 17%. And you can see this when you look historically. So like during the civil rights, some of the murders and the bombings that happened during the civil rights movements in the 1960s, it was decades before those murderers were brought to justice. And that's an example of when you're over that 17% threshold event, you have a lot these illegal criminal activities have a lot more support in the area, and they're easier to sustain. People can stay hidden for years and decades, and that is creating a really dangerous circumstance. But the context I'm talking in now is the January 6th riot, insurrection, and the concern that this represents mass violence and mass instability. Well, this was a test. It was an unplanned experiment. Well, people warned about it, but it certainly wasn't something that was on the schedule. But the January 6th riot is an excellent example of the 17% threshold in effect, and I'm very pleased to say that overall, we are passing that experiment. What I mean by that is if you look at the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection, it clearly shows that we are so far beneath that 17% threshold effect. I mean, and I'll go over the numbers here in a bit. The entire society has grabbed together these images, this data, they're parsing through it, but close relatives, associates, friends, colleagues are identifying people in those to the authorities. And what this means is that if you were in that Capitol, you know, for whatever reason or cause, you're being investigated right now. There's still some people they're trying to identify, but there's 400 active investigations going on right now. And a lot of those people are being turned in, identified, and not just by, you know, people on the net who have an axe to grind, well, you were supporting Trump and I don't like you. They're being turned in by their relatives, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, co-workers. I know that person. You know, and this is kind of the difference between having a political difference and being willing to support an insurgency. Now, again, the 70% threshold, it can mean both support and intimidation. And I think it doesn't mean that this isn't risky. This isn't to say this wasn't a risky event, but it's to put kind of a context in, at least from someone who studies insurgencies, as to, are we at the tipping point of a mass insurgency or mass instability? And just as I forecast about before the election, I don't think we are. And this was a great example of it, because what you saw after January 6th was this immediate pullback and revulsion of society based on what happened. And I have some numbers here, and I'm going to read just to make sure I get them accurate here. But so, as of the last time I checked, the FBI is running 400 individual investigations, so 400 people. Now, we don't know how many people were actually in the Capitol. I've seen estimates from 500 to 1,000. When I looked at the crowds on the videos the days of, I'd estimate there was at most 2,000 to 5,000 around the Capitol. So, you know, ballpark it, 500 to 1,000 people got in the Capitol. There are 400 active investigations going on right now. And some quick demographics of what those are. You know, we worry about how much does this represent a broad swath of society, or how much does it represent certain focus groups that are concerning, like police or military, or are there certain states? And this is kind of a mixed bag. So based on the investigations and the charging documents which have been released and the arrest, of the 400 individuals, only 15 of them so far are prior veterans. So there's this concern that the military has a large presence in this extremist groups. Now, this isn't, remember, this group is the hardcore of the hardcore. They traveled to get there. They decided to go out on a very cold January, and they decided to, clearly, even more so than going to the Capitol, they went into the Capitol. And I mean, I was looking at the video the day of, and you could see people who were on those stairs noping themselves out of that scenario and backing off. So the people who went in, this is a survivor bias, that this is the hardest of the hardcore. So this is, you know, it's not reflective of the overall support things like QAnon and stuff like that have. But, you know, 15 veterans, 2 of them were currently serving in Army Reserve. The Army is investigating that. Law enforcement, there were 4 active duty law enforcement within the 400. Now, that's only 1%, but you're thinking these are active duty cops, you know, and I don't know whether they were attacking other cops or things like that, but you would hope that that's a real problem. All 4 of those are no longer police officers. I mean, even though their cases are still ongoing, they're out of the force. So that's, I mean, that's some good news in that they're not heavily penetrated by the military and the law enforcement. Some of the less good news is there were people from 40 different states. The big states: Texas, 18, New York, 14, Florida, 13, California, 10, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, 10 or 9. So you're talking broad geographical distribution, and you have age ranges. It's kind of interesting. The age range here is about 42, so it's kind of like a Gen X insurrection. Like the only time my generation ever got enough cojones to, I mean, we couldn't even keep we couldn't even keep Firefly, but apparently we're behind the insurrection. Great. No, I mean, it's the average age is 42, but it ranges from 20 to 70. And you can see that in the demographics. Like, I do a lot of crowd analysis. You look over those videos, you see wide range of ages. There are only 22 women so far being investigated. I think there was a higher distribution in the videos that I saw, but again, a minority of them were women. Of those 400 investigations, so 206 individuals have been arrested so far and charged. So that's 50% of the investigations. Now, the investigations are not capped. They say when this is said and done, there may be between 500 and 750 individuals charged from this, but they're currently at 400. About 50% have been charged, 160 in federal court and 27 in local court. And you can see in the links that are going with this video, or that if you're watching on YouTube later, I have the links down there. And so this, I think, speaks to that 17% threshold effect. How quickly, this is a massive investigation. They've had over 200,000 different pieces of tips and data. There's been huge volunteer and investigative journalist efforts to put this together. ProPublica, again, there's an archive in the link. They went through all the videos that were scraped off Parler, and in Parler they had the metadata, so they knew the location and the time. They actually organized every single one of those videos from Parler based on whether it was at the rally or outside the Capitol, inside the Capitol, or after the Capitol, and they did it in chronological time. So you can see, if you go up and watch, it's disturbing video in this, so I mean, be careful when you go on there, but they have these things in a row, and you can literally watch it unfold from all the different perspectives. The Faces of Riots was another archive image using machine intelligence and social media scraping. From the 827 videos they had, they identified 6,000 images of faces. Now, this isn't 6,000 people there. I don't think there were that many at the whole event, but 6,000 images. A lot of these have shown up on the FBI's most wanted list. And the FBI's most wanted list is, again, it's a link down there because they've got a couple images, probably 150 more images they're trying to identify, which tells you that there's still more people to be arrested. And this just goes to show the amount of two things at once. Once is society has turned on these people, right? The Lawfare blog link at the bottom has every charging indictment. The initial charges on this were very, very serious, ranging from 5 to 20 years. It's going to be illegal trespassing, conspiracy to obstruct Congress. It's going to be carrying a weapon. Those are just, when you're in a federal prosecution scenario, the initial charges they go with are not often the final charges. They're just putting something in to stick you in jail and keep you there. I imagine more charges are going to come out, and we've already seen some charges of insurrection. We've seen some for seditious conspiracy. People are worried about extremists. There were 23 individuals of the 400 have been identified with extremist ties. They come from the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, 3 Percenters, Texas Freedom Force, and the QAnon movement, which, of course, Buffalo guy is sitting in a jail cell right now, and he was the one actually charged with insurrection. Let's go through. So the 17% effect, there's two things, one of which is society. I think that is fair. But there's another thing. This is a social media heavy environment. I think it was Mike who had this great meme about how, for 20 years, we were fighting a war on terror where our opponents had to use Russian servers that were hosted in caves in Afghanistan, pinging Russian satellites that they could only use a cell phone once and then had to burn it. They were living in absolute dismal squalor and poverty, hiding from the forces. And here we have an insurrection where a guy is sitting in his living room and going on Parler and posting a video of himself. So, I mean, the sheer amount of data, self-implicating, self-incriminating data that has been shared, 17% may be a little low. It may now be 30%, because the ability of people, both netizens, sort of volunteer groups, of which a lot of these are, investigative journalists, they use the artificial intelligence, they use machine learning, they use these scraping tools. It really changes that dynamic. So, there's both the social revulsion aspect, but there's also a lot of this technology is making it easier to identify. Let me go through a couple questions here. Thanks everyone for joining. Let's see, here we go. Tony, society's response immensely reassuring. Yep. Mike's asking if the percentage dependent on the political landscape of each subjective location. You could be below national 17%, but everyone in your town is all in it. Right. Mike's got a very good point. The 17%, first of all, it's a notional number I completely made up. So caveat that. Second, you can do a fractal segmentation, which means at a country level, 17%, but if a state, they're beneath that, then that state's going to be thing. You could even go down to a county, a municipality. I would argue, I view criminal gang activity as a form of insurgent activity. So I would argue in certain criminal gang areas, they have effectively passed that threshold whereby intimidation or support, people are not willing to report them to police. This is very common when you see insurgency environments. Part of the reasons insurgencies work is they've either intimidated or have the support of the local population sufficient enough that they're not going to turn them into the police, or they view the police as the enemy. So yes, very much it can be fractally segmented. And I think the example I used of the civil rights activities in the South, during the South, during civil rights, they may have passed that threshold and been over 30-40% support for things like the KKK and the anti-civil rights movements. But if you go to a different part of the country, that support may be different. So that it's very good that it's locally. You can fragment these, and a fractal segmentation as far down as you want to go. Ms. Falconberry, do you think President Trump or the individuals at the Capitol will have serious repercussions for their actions, or are these investigations just nominal for now? I mentioned that the charging indictments are all serious federal felonies, usually ranging from 5 to 20 years. That's before they get into adding the ones that are harder to prove, like seditious conspiracy, insurrection. There's assaults of federal officers in there. There's all sorts of fairly serious charge. President Trump, I'm going to leave to when we do an impeachment review, because I've got that mega mullet coming out that's going to talk all about the president himself. And he's a little bit of a different circumstance to look at. Because of he wasn't there physically, but definitely he was involved, in my opinion. Yeah, Laura's pointing out, and Laura's doing a great job. If you haven't followed Laura Mertz, follow her if you can. She does great work. Several of those investigations involving multiple people, so 400 investigations represent more than 400 individuals. Laura, if you have an estimate on the total number of individuals, I know they've only arrested about that 150 to 200 so far, but if you have better numbers, go ahead and put them in. Other questions, comments? Sounds like some of the police officers are reinstated. I'll have to look into that. Firefly shout out, of course. I love mocking Firefly. It's a perfect Gen X thing. No one cares of us. We're such a small generation. They cancel it. Good conversation about grand juries, that some of these charges are going to escalate. Yep, Legal Eagle has good stuff too. Trying to see. Okay, Proud Boys, let's talk real briefly about Proud Boys in Canada, because that came up earlier. Proud Boys, I mentioned, was one of the extremist groups affiliated with it. We'll get into what the definition of domestic terrorism is in one of the media literacies that starts up here, but Canada has declared Proud Boys a domestic terror group, and the US hasn't. And I've gone over this before. I actually did it over the summer when these, when President Trump was trying to declare Antifa a terrorist group. The US, by habit, precedence, and very good historical reason, does not declare domestic terror groups. And there's a really good reason for this. A lot of people get upset when they think, well, why aren't the Proud Boys declared a domestic terror group? Well, I kind of mentioned some of the reasons. The first is foreign terror groups. The law is, if you provide material aid or support to a foreign terror group, I'm talking ISIS, Al-Qaeda, any of those things, you get a federal felony. But a domestic terror group, there's this really fuzzy line between the First Amendment protections on free speech and these groups. So if you say, I support Antifa and I donate $50 to my local Antifa, you know, a lot of people imagine they have a donation booth out there. It's not, doesn't really work that way. I'm just kind of abstracting, right? You provide some sort of material support, you could be charged with a federal felony, but are you really inciting violence and participating in violence when you show ideological political support? And that's an area that gets into this larger discussion of the incitement of a riot and the incitement of an insurrection and things like seditious conspiracy. I'm going to get over those when we go through those deconflicting conflict terms. So, but Canada, very important, Canada's free speech laws are not the same as the United States. I know people are surprised by this. I actually have a lot of Canadian folks that I talk with, I learn a lot from. Shout out to Valeria Panda. She gives a lot of good insights in Canada. You know, Canada's free speech laws are different. And therefore, in Canada, they're able to declare a domestic terror group. Now, the US, even if we said this was a good idea, like in principle, in the US, we used to have this, in the FBI used to have its target list of domestic terror groups. And what they do is they target these civil rights groups, treat them as if they were terrorists, and use the laws against them. So in the US at least, and you know, other countries have this as well to varying degree, there's a history of bad faith actions. When we declare domestic terror groups, we use domestic terrorism laws and say that group is a terror group, that we then use that to target dissent or reform efforts or things. We're not using it for actual terrorists. Now, the way the US handles this and the way the FBI handles it, you'll go on their page and they'll say most wanted individuals, and they'll say types of domestic terror. So they'll report white nationalism as a threat, environmental terrorism as a left-wing extremist threat. They'll report the types of terrorism as movements, and then they'll identify individuals within those movements, because an individual has done acts. An individual, you can distinguish an individual who has done a terrorist act or is suspected of committing a terrorist act. That's a little different than representing ideological support. So the FBI navigates it that way. They list out the terrorist movements and the ones that are of concern, and then they target individuals, and that way they're not naming groups. So I wouldn't expect to see a named terrorist group. And I'd be, as a professional in this field, I don't think we should get in the business of naming terrorist groups, at least domestically. It's too much historical misuse and too much ripe abuse. Jennifer's saying, what about judges that let arrested people go to Mexico on vacation before they, instead of saying on house arrest? I'm not, would they count to the 17%? I'm not familiar with that case, but to me, if what you say is true, that judge sounds like, now with bail hearings, it's always really technical. And the thing I try and keep in mind is that it's easy to say we want judges to throw the books at people in bail hearings when it's something like this. But in a lot of other circumstances, we don't want them to throw the books. Now, if those are the facts of the case, that there was nothing else extenuating, they had a previous scheduled vacation to a foreign country, that sounds like a bad idea to me. That judge, you will find judges are parts of these 17%. Law enforcement might be part of the 17%. Each one you're going to have to look at individually, and I don't know that specific case, but from the surface, it sounds like not the best idea. Okay, Ed's saying it was a pre-planned business retreat and with a defined begin-a date. Ed's kind of describing here. There's a good discussion breaking out. I don't want to get into it too much because I got to keep moving here. Yeah, Mike's pointing out, here's a good point to the larger issue of identifying domestic terror groups. You two collected funds for the IRA in the 1980s. Again, I'm not saying that's true. Mike Morrison said it's true. So if you want to sue someone, that's Mike, M-I-K-E. No, if that premise is true, those facts are true, and you two did that, you could get in a lot of trouble. You could get charged. But that's where the especially in the United Kingdom, where IRA was treated as a serious issue. So let's get into now actually some of these distinctions. So some of these things like terror and insurrection and riot, there's been a lot of discussion and people trying to name what happened on January 6th. So I want to go into a media literacy to I work in this field. I work in violence and instability, and I wanted to define some of these terms so that we could kind of get beyond this meaning. So this is going to be a little bit of a interesting. Here's the terms of conflict that are in play right now, right? And I've ordered them somewhat, believe it or not, from bottom to top, or top to bottom. The easiest ones to charge, and of course protest I'm starting with. That protest is a non-criminal, non-violent civil activity. So that's the baseline. This is not illegal. Then as you go down the list, it gets harder and harder to charge someone with that crime and prove they were doing that crime. It also gets harder for them to actually do that crime. The constituent elements of that act are actually getting increasingly challenging. Now, the basis for these is I work with the US government. So my definition of these terms, where it applies, is going to come from US federal law, because I'm like, why reinvent the wheel? If there's existing law, these laws were put together with a lot of thought. Let's not try and take an event like January 6th and make up new law around it. Let's apply the existing law and see where it falls. The other thing to keep in mind, and I've described this before when I discussed protests and riots, these are complex, multifaceted things where lots of stuff is going on. A difference of 5 minutes in the same place or 50 yards at the same time can create completely different perspectives of what's going on. And it is entirely possible in something as large as the Capitol or these protests and riots that happen over the summer, where you have multiple simultaneous activities going on of which all people are not sharing in that act. And this is a key point, is that you can have a riot, an insurrection, and domestic terrorism happening all at the same time, but that doesn't mean every person in the Capitol is guilty of all three of those things. You have to really be careful about what the evidence, and this is a big part of due process. Same thing that comes up when we talk about arsons and the riots over the summer. Just because an arson happens doesn't mean that the people in that protest are culpable of that arson, but it does mean the people who precipitated the arson are culpable. That's criminal and it's wrong. I have a very strict first principle on violence. Unless it is imminent self-defense, individual or collective self-defense from harm to person or property, violence is a no-go. So arson's out for me. Street violence is out for me. These violent acts for me across the board are first principle, they're wrong. But you can go down this list and you can begin to deconflict these terms. So let's walk through some of them. First of all, what happened at the rally? So we start with the rally. That's where the president gave his little talk. That's a protest, right? Nothing illegal there. Maybe misguided, not well informed, full of conspiracy nonsense. Probably not itself inherently illegal, except for what happens following it. And this is a key thing to know in US law. Free speech, we often don't charge incitement charges unless something actually happens. Because, and I mentioned this before, there's something called the Brandenburg test. To violate the, to make your speech criminally, to make your speech not protected by the First Amendment, to engage in criminal speech on an incitement charge, you have to prove that there was specific action directed, that action followed through immediately thereafter, and there was a high likelihood of that action occurring. If I say I want to, you know, go out and scratch a bunch of cars or encourage everyone to go out and scratch cars, right? There's not a likelihood you guys are going to do it. When you do it, it's not going to be things. But what goes on with the rally, the reason the rally is going to come into sharp focus is the president specifically said, go down to that place. He gave encouragement. Again, I'm going to get this in the mega mullet, but there was a rally, and immediately following what he asked them to do, at least up into through the protest at the Capitol, he actually asked them to do, they followed on it. And the question is, was that a likely consequence of what he said? Because he used lots of words of fighting and things like that. That we'll get into more. But as we go through this now, everything that follows from the protest is an illegal criminal act. So first of all, riot, right? U.S. Code 20, Chapter 18, 2102. The definitions of a riot, it's an act of violence by one person that constitutes a clear and present danger to property or person or property, but you have to do it while in a group of 3 or more. This is why I say riots are pretty easy. I mean, you think about this, you could have a riot at a football game, and frequently they do. You know, this is a very small threshold. You need at least 3 people, and one of them amongst them is doing something that causes harm or a clear and present danger of harm to person or property. Incitement to riot, and I've bolded some words here. The law on incitement to riot is you organize, promote, encourage, participate in, or carry on a riot. Now, the word encourage here is the word that's going to get President Trump in trouble and all these other individuals, even if they weren't at the riot themselves, if they are proven to have encouraged the acts. And again, this is all on social media, so it's documented. But this urging or instigating does not include advocacy of ideas or expressions of belief, only as long as those ideas and beliefs are not themselves advocacies of acts of violence. And this, again, boldness, or the assertion of the rightness of or the right to commit violent acts. So this is really clear. If the president gets on stage and says, I think we were defrauded by election, I think the election was fraud, and that's terrible, and we should all come out in 2022 and vote back, he's in the clear. But when he gives a speech that says, hey, go down to this spot and interrupt this thing that's going on, or during the insurrection himself, when he says that they're patriots or gives any indication of the right assertion of the rightness or the right to commit, that this is a justified act, that crosses that rather bright line into a much grayer area where you're now dealing really clear with an incitement charge. And I'm not going to say whether he is or isn't in this. I'm going to let the mullet talk to it. Okay, I will say, because I've done the work, I think he incited the insurrection, but I understand there's valid disagreements on that, and it's because you go from a very bright line of, hey, the election was fraud, I think I was cheated. That's advocacy of ideas or expression of beliefs. That's protected. But as soon as you get into encouraging an act, especially if the act happens, or you get into the rightness or the right to commit violent acts, you are crossing into that gray area of an incitement to riot. Domestic terrorism, the next most easy thing you can charge people with, Chapter 18, U.S. Code 2331, right? These are acts that are dangerous to human life, criminal, with an intention to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. And these are the criteria. I've bolded 2 here. The next 2 are key. Influence the policy of government by intimidating or coercing a civilian population. Now, you can argue that the broadcast nature of this event was intended to intimidate or coerce the civilian population. I think that's a weak argument. The much stronger argument is the next one down. Influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. So much of what goes on January 6th, it's important to remember, is this wasn't just storming a Capitol at a time to hold a sit-in. This was during the certification of the Electoral College. So there is an active act of lawful authority going on that has enormous implications, that this movement was designed to impede, obstruct, and change. And so this here, this domestic terrorism, I think this is the strongest piece of the domestic. Again, this isn't going to apply to everyone, but they're going to find evidence that by intimidation or coercion, they wanted to influence, to stop the Electoral College counts, to reverse it, to do any of those things. Once you're in the Capitol and you're doing that, you're probably guilty of domestic terrorism. Whether they charge it or not, that's one thing. The other 2, I don't think there's much evidence. I know there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, not mass destruction because they didn't bring in bombs, but assassination or kidnapping. There was a lot of rumors floating around that clearly they were intending to do that. I don't think the evidence is very strong. I think this is, and we'll get into with when we talk about the historical examples of insurrection, a lot of insurrections start as protests that form into riots that then morph into insurrections. They are not exceedingly well planned out to the point where assassination and kidnapping is like. Now, there may be individuals, again, individuals inside that mass group, maybe somebody had that idea and they find evidence of it, they're going to hit them with that one. But overall, I don't think that's going to be much of what's going on. So right there, we've deconflicted domestic terrorism and riots. Let me pause here. Wow, there's so many good comments. Let's see if I can catch up here. Okay, Laura, based on interview, I've seen people reported out by people who have been arrested. Many said they went to and entered the Capitol at the direction of the president. That to me is quite telling. The perpetrators state in court that they took these acts as direction requests. That is useful, but only to a degree, because think about somebody who wants to cut a deal with the police, say in a protest, right? And there was a case here in Louisiana, one of the Black Lives Matters protests. There was and this is a question of incitement to riot, a perfect example of what I see the discussion of criminal justice reform. The organizer of the Black Lives protest was charged because someone in that crowd threw a rock at the police officer. And because the organizer organized the protest, he was charged with incitement of riot. And I don't know if that case has been resolved. It was an ongoing case in Louisiana. The question is, do you want to just take it on the testimony of the person who threw the rock? Because the police may say, hey, turn on this guy and say you were following his direction, we'll cut you a deal. I think that gets into a gray area. Now, clearly, I think as us as civilians and the senators as politicians, the trial coming up is not a court of law. But if this were a court of law, I'd be hesitant to say, first of all, I'd be hesitant to say that someone simply saying they took direction is evidence in itself enough. But I think the actions of the president, the statements of the president, and his actions as we get to insurrection, after and during the insurrection itself, are very telling, because it's not just what he did at the rally, and that's the key part. It's what happened during the event and after the event as well. If they were planning or doing it already, is it really inciting and encouraging? Mike, great question. Yes, it is. If you happen to be unlucky enough to be standing in front of a people who are determined to murder a bunch of folks, and you say, just as a joke, hey, go murder them, and they do, guess what? You won the bad idea lottery for that day, almost as bad as investing in GameStop. Yeah, so if people were already planning, and you get out there and you make a public, and we'll get to this in insurrection, because it's this incitement isn't just that you caused them to do it, but you gave them a motivation, a rightness to act, a rightness of their commission of the act. You gave them moral fortitude. All of these things are wrapped into this definition of incitement. Zip tie guy brought them for a reason, but his intent. So the zip ties, I'm of mixed opinions of that, because zip ties are used all over the world in flash riots now to create spontaneous barriers. And what they often use are the industrial strength, human zip ties, because what they do, like you saw this in Hong Kong, they bring zip ties in knowing that they want to make barriers on the spot, and then they use the zip ties to create the barriers to impede people removing them after they've entered. So I would want to see specific evidence of where did they get the zip ties, obviously anything on his computer, pull up like that. This is where kidnapping, you really got to get into a little bit more than, obviously it's a material thing. I think they need to look at the guy very carefully. But I'd say just having zip ties in a modern protest movement is not indication of kidnapping sufficient alone, because of this this contextual factor of what you can use. Now, it could be evidence of a riot that you're going to, damage property by zip tying them together. But I'd want to see more evidence. And then, so let's go back to keep, because now we're going to get to the interesting. That's the easy stuff. Riots and domestic terrorism. Clearly a riot happened at Capitol Hill. There was 3 or more people, one of which did something. Domestic terrorism, I'm willing to argue some of the people in there were guilty of domestic terrorism. Let's go to the next ones, because now we go into the bonus rounds. Okay, easy stuff's out of the way. Next one, believe it or not, the next most easy thing to prove is rebellion and insurrection. This is 18 U.S. Code 2383. And in the Mega Mullet, I go through this in detail. Now, rebellions and insurrections are key. A lot of people have a no true Scotsman approach to what a rebellion or insurrection is. And this is why I go to the law and the historical cases. They want to say, well, you have to be armed to have an insurrection, or you have to succeed to have an insurrection, or it has to last a bunch of months to have an insurrection. No. It's 2 or more people who do any of the following: conspire to overthrow the government. I don't think that was things. There was no really legitimate way to overthrow the government. Levy war against the government. These folks aren't levying war. Oppose by force the authority of the government. You can see this if the police were coming into an area and you're resisting that like they're coming in to arrest someone or something like that, you can see that opposing by force. But the next two here are the deets and the receipts that will put people in jail for insurrection. These two specifically really apply to what happened on January 6th. It's by force, prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law. Now that seems really broad. Like, hey, if I cause a problem with someone issuing a speeding ticket, am I guilty of insurrection or rebellion? No. Insurrection doesn't have a lot of case law, but insurrection is one of the most well understood concepts in constitutional scholarship and founding father discussion because they lived it. If you go back and read any of these founding articles, insurrection is probably one of the most common terms for conflict that they use in discussion of what they did, other rebellions that occur, all the way through about the 18th, 19th century. So there's a really good foundation of what an insurrection is and isn't. But by force, prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law, and I'm going to give you a historical example of this. The last one is the key one. By force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States contrary to the authority thereof. That last phrase is Greek, contrary to the authority thereof. So this is where the insurrection, for me, the litmus test for an insurrection is not just that you went into federal property, which happens, but you did it specifically to hinder, prevent, or delay the execution or authority. And this is where Trump is in a world of hurt and those people went in the Capitol, because it wasn't just, look, the Michigan COVID protest that happened last year, right? People go into the Capitol, everyone was really worried because they had firearms, but the law is you can carry a firearm. I don't consider that insurrection. They weren't preventing, hindering, or delaying the execution laws, and they weren't by force or seizure taking possession of a property. January 6th in the Capitol, that is the Electoral College certification. That is a execution of a law, perhaps one of the most critical execution of the law. And they went in there to delay or hinder it or and seize the property upon which it was occurring. That is what makes this circumstance very, very different from all the other ones that we can talk about. Now, there's some gray area cases like the Mahler wildlife refugee. I wouldn't call that an insurrection because even though it's federal property that they occupied, they're not really delaying the execution of law. You may get them on seizure of property, but I would be careful. I would prefer that to call domestic terrorism or something else. I wouldn't call it insurrection. I want to save insurrection for specific acts, but these acts don't have to be long-term in nature. They don't have to involve tens of thousands of people. They don't have to involve armaments. And the reason why I say insurrection and rebellion are very well studied is we've had a lot of them in the country. Let's put aside the big one, the American Revolution, and the second big one, the Civil War, which, by the way, President Lincoln called the Civil War a great insurrection for a reason. Those were not accidental words on his part. There's like I said, insurrection means a lot when you get into the history of the United States. But some historical examples that are similar to the January 6th. So I went looking through all these different ones. First of all, Shays Rebellion happens before technically the United States of America with the Constitution. We're operating under the Articles of Confederation. George Washington has to put down what this is there's a debt, Revolutionary War debt has caused this financial crisis where there's mass inflation, the Continental Congress, the money's worthless, and the debts that farmers are owed can't be paid. So courts are set up, debtors court, where the farmers are brought in, they're forced to liquidate, and the creditors get all their stuff. The Shays Rebellion specifically involved groups of people entering a court and disrupting the court proceedings when a case was happening such that the debt could not be liquidated. That fits the definition of force to prevent, of hinder or delay the execution of law and to seize a property. These were small courthouses. Granted, it was a couple of thousand people, but each individual one may have been 50 people, 100 people. That's an insurrection. They did it for debt relief, but it's still an insurrection. And you go back and you look at the founding fathers, they all knew this. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, all of these folks are referring to these things as insurrections in their own words. So it's kind of like, if you want to go with the founding fathers as knowing what they were talking about, here's an example. Then in the Great Revival period, which happens, the Civil War happens, Reconstruction happens, and the Revival or the Great Awakening happens, which is the return of white supremacy to the South. There's this huge backlash and a series of insurrections over 2 decades. I classify that entire period as an insurgency, but there were a couple in key here. The election riot of 1874, very specifically applicable to Capitol. An election happened, they didn't like the results, so these groups like the Red Shirt League, the White League, the KKK, they rallied up a mob. The mob stormed the state legislature or the city hall where the elected officials were about to be seated and sworn in and disrupted it, right? Very similar to the Capitol Hill. You have a riot that forms in and they go to take possession to prevent a political act that they don't want to see happen. Battle of Liberty Place in 1874, Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, very similar. Here's one that is directly relevant, and it's important because it's 20th century, right? The Capitol Hill shooting of 1954. You have several Puerto Rican nationalist separatists, right? There's a separatist movement in Puerto Rico. They've already conducted several acts of terrorism. It's a well-known thing. They come into the U.S. Capitol, right? Same building, same location. They open fire, 5 people die. I mean, I don't know how much closer you can get to what happened on January 6th in the Puerto Rican. They wanted the government to do something that wasn't being done. They go in, shots are fired, some by the people, some by the police. People die, 5 people die. In charging these individuals, they are actually charged with seditious conspiracy and insurrection. And it is the case law of this that I think is going to be cited, because what they found is that a big part of insurrection, or we'll get into the seditious conspiracy here next, but this is the case that is going to be the case law that I think becomes relevant to this. And its companion piece is seditious conspiracy, which I probably just realized that I don't have a thing. So I'm going to do it off the top of my head. The link's in there. Seditious conspiracy is when you, let me actually make sure to check here. Pause while I check to see if I've got this. Nope. Interesting. Okay, I thought I had seditious conspiracy. I'll have to spitball it here. Give me a quick second. We'll edit this out to make it look intelligent later. So seditious conspiracy is actually when 2 or more people conspire to incite effectively what is a rebellion and insurrection, or give aid and comfort to an insurrection that has or is happening. And this is where I think Trump has run afoul, and a lot of people will run afoul, because it's not just did you incite them to do something, what did you do during and as it was over? Because if you give aid and comfort to an insurrection, you are guilty of seditious conspiracy. And it's this case from the Capitol Hill shooting of 1954, went all the way up to a district appeal, didn't go to the Supreme Court, but went up to a U.S. appeals court, and came down with a ruling that even if you weren't at the location where the violence happened, if you gave encouragement or aid or comfort to the people that were involved, you were guilty by that act by seditious conspiracy. And this puts Trump's behavior in the White House during the insurrection, which we don't know for sure. There's lots of allegations. We don't know for sure what it was, what he did, what he didn't do. That's where they're going to call witnesses and try and figure out what he was doing at the time. There's lots of reports, but we know for sure he came out with that tweet at about 6 p.m., the 6:04 p.m. It was after Biden, President-elect Biden had done his video tweet. Trump came out, and in that tweet, he refers to the people storming the Capitol as great patriots, great Americans. That is encouragement, aid, and comfort for an ongoing insurrection. That is seditious conspiracy. So this is important to remember. Again, impeachment trials have nothing to do with the law, everything to do with politics. So we got to remember, we can't overthink this. But if this was a law case, when the president does that at 6 o'clock, this is, you know, well into it, he's giving aid and comfort to the people who are committing insurrection. Twitter did him a favor by pulling that out. Of course, it's been captured. You know, it's not like anything disappears off the internet. But that right there, I think, would be enough for seditious conspiracy. And the last one we're going to get to in the law, then I'll go to some more questions, because we're going to get to another category that people like to talk about, is treason. Again, Chapter 18, great chapter for violence and instability, 2381. Treason is when you levy war against the United States, you adhere to the enemies of the United States, or you're giving the enemies of the United States aid or comfort. I don't think anyone that was involved in, based on the evidence so far in January 6th, is guilty of treason. And a lot of people are like, traitors, treason. No, you've got to be dealing. Treason is the hardest thing to prove, because it deals with levying war, not just an insurrection or riot, but levying war, or being supported by an enemy of the United States. Now, there's some allegations that there were suspicious Bitcoin transfers by Russians into some of these groups. Well, that's a question of, is Russia an enemy of the United States? Are we in a state of war? No. And so it gets really tricky with treason to prove this, to the point that you need to in a court. So I don't think we're going to see any treason charges come out of this. I think we're going to see a lot of the riots. I think we're going to see some of the insurrections and some of the seditious conspiracy, but I don't think we're going to see any treason. Let's see, go to the questions before I go on to the next set. Zip tie. Yeah, the guy who claimed he found the zip ties and forgot to give them the cops is not helping himself. It's one of those things as a lawyer. Don't ever talk unless you need to. People watching Hamilton. Turn. Yep, Turn is a good one. Lucas is asking, how do you think a Senate acquittal of President Trump for seditious conspiracy will affect a hypothetical court case for the same act? Not going to get into that because that's an impeachment. Great question. Yep, Christie's doing the links here for seditious insurrection. Could Trump be charged by the law for insurrection? Again, going into impeachment. Generally, quick answer to these questions on impeachment. Impeachment is a political act. It does not prohibit you from being charged by crime of the same act after the impeachment trial is over. Mike, verbal support is considered aid and comfort if it falls within that criteria of hitting the Brandenburg test of incitement and or giving the rightness to commit a criminal act. If President Trump had said, it's tragic that there's a bunch of people getting hurt right now on the Capitol, I think that's bad, he's probably in safe ground. When he refers to the people as great patriots, great Americans, stuff like that, you could argue he didn't know, he's uninformed, he knows the people at his rally, he doesn't know what's going on. That could be a defense made, but when you it's one thing to kind of do it as a general sense. It's another to speak to the specific people and give them a righteous, a rightness of the commission of the act. Because remember, the building was not cleared yet at the time. So think of it this way: if someone storms a state legislature, let's say a random state legislature, and while they're inside, a state representative says, "Attaboy, Adams, don't leave, hold your ground. You're doing a good job. You're doing the Lord's work." That is considered that verbal. Now, 3 weeks later, if I say, yeah, I thought they were right, that's not really giving aid and comfort. It's not with these speech laws, the proximity to the events is very, very key in how these judge these. The Brandenburg test, and this is why it's so bad for Trump. Had that rally occurred the weekend before, I think he'd be fine. It occurred the morning of, the people went directly from there to the next, the things happened, and during that event, he had those statements. So it's the proximity of the events themselves that is a key lens here, not just that any verbal support is made at any time. Yeah, so let's go now to the really hard ones that are mainly for deconflicting conflict, because it's unlikely people can do them. This is going to be a really long Ask Me Anything, but people are interested. So insurgency, right? Non-state actor challenging state actor. This is my specialty, insurgencies. They make it, an insurgent makes it impossible to perform a state function. So the functions, they usurp the functions. Some of these functions they take onto themselves. Local level political legitimacy, rule of law, monopoly on the use of force, taxation, control of movement, regulation of economy. Insurgents begin, not all of them, but they take some of them and they often co-occupy a spot with the state authority where they may control it at the night, the state authority controls it during the day. Generally, an insurgency must pass that 17% notional threshold. We aren't there yet. This isn't an insurgency. So this isn't, what happened on January 6th is not an insurgency. Clear that deck. Revolutions and civil wars. This gets tricky only because these terms are so convoluted that it's really hard to tease them apart. But Mike Duncan, great podcaster, he does revolutions. He describes a revolution as a cross-class alliance of dissidents overthrowing the regime by extra-legal means that then alters the political system in some fundamental ways. You can find a bazillion definitions. They're all variations of one or more factions have a mutually exclusive claim to power to which they fight over that power, and they have some percentage of the population that supports them in that power. Now, I add to this, when I distinguish a revolution and a civil war, to me, a revolution is when a new faction is arising and that new faction starts with 0% of the state and military power. They have to create new institutions. They create a new government. They create a new military. They're often recruiting from scratch. They may get defectors, but they're building anew. And often revolutions have a social system change within them. Civil wars, the difference is they're often pre-existing factions. Each faction takes some of the military and state power. When they split, they may have local troops come to their side. They may have the legislatures that they were operating in. These carry over institutions and military into the factions. They absorb it. They don't have to create it anew. They're simply taking it. Also, the social change in civil war is not as common. They often occur because of ethnic separatism or ideological bases. Now, you may say, Tim, that sounds a lot like the American Revolution, right? That was a colonial system of government which you know, existed beforehand and simply took some of this stuff, you know, away from the king. Isn't that, you just said that's a civil war? Well, this is the problem, is historians don't follow these guidelines. They're not scientific. Your mileage may vary, and this is a very disputed area. Revolutions can become civil wars, like the Arab Spring in Syria became the Syrian Civil War. Revolutions themselves may actually be better typified as civil wars because they evolve pre-existing factions. It's very complicated, but the key thing is January 6th was not a revolution or civil war. There is no, none of these things apply. And the last one is a coup. And this one has been bugging me because everyone jumps on coup, and it's like the word collusion. The word collusion does not exist in the criminal code. Like, there's a perfect word that you could use instead of collusion. It's called conspiracy, and it has a definition. Likewise, coup is not defined anywhere in the US code, and everyone wants to use it for January 6th. Well, I don't think it applies, because the coup, so a revolution or civil war has a faction that has some sort of popular support. Even if it's not a lot, it can be some. A coup, by definition, almost is a small group or faction that seizes power. They have little to no popular support, and they often consist of prior instituted military, peacekeeping, or other lawful institutions. So there's this pre-existing nature of a coup. They've already in place, they already have the levers of power, but they use those levers in illegal ways. So disobeying civilian control, mutiny against superior officers in the military. You're seeing this in Myanmar right now, right? The Myanmar coup, the coups that happened literally over the last 3 days, is a perfect example of this. The military is the military that was in place that Aung San was over as the civilian government. They obviously had a lot of power. They'd been a dictatorship for decades. While she was in prison, she gets released from prison, kind of cuts a deal with them, goes to, you know, make a deal with the devil in some ways, and now it's bitter. But they were already existing in these institutional powers, and all they did is simply take the power back. And the power in a coup is gained by the seizure of state institutions. So you're seizing not a building, you're seizing the literal institution of power itself. The courts, communications, you often find radio, TV stations seized, political assemblies. They're seized and held by these pre-existing factions that are under the control of a very small group. And the small group faction then becomes the governing power. So everyone wants to call January 6th a coup. I don't agree. Now, this is Tim's definition, so you can yell at me and throw things at me. January 6th is not a coup. It's like Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's not a coup, you know. So what is January 6th? January 6th consists of a riot, domestic terrorism, and insurrection all overlaying in one event. And that doesn't mean that everyone in the event is guilty of all three, but these things all happen co-simultaneously. And you're going to have some people, I think, the charges are going to reflect a mix of these things. The vast majority are going to be riot-related charges, trespassing, unlawful entry, illegal obstruction. A few are going to be domestic terrorism, probably the ones that are violence related, or if they find someone was actively planning to kidnap or assassinate, that'll come down as domestic terrorism. A lot are going to be insurrection, not as much as the riot, but a lot more than domestic terrorism are going to be insurrection, because the intent was to impede or hinder the lawful execution of the Electoral College. So this is a situation now. Over on the right are the ones it's not. It's not treason, it's not revolution or civil war, it's not a coup, right? It's these three things all coexisting on the same spot in time. And that's not unusual. All of the insurrections I listed in the historical examples, many of them started as riots and then became insurrections. The Shays Rebellion, they start as rebellions and they become, these things flow in and out of each other all the time. Let's see here. People are discussing about what's going on in the House with Greens, so this is good. McCarthy, let's see, I'm trying to skip what's going on in the House right now. Lucas, when I asked about the coup, is because there was evidently some law enforcement or military or other institutional support behind the Capitol insurrection, or at least there were allegations of such. Lucas, good question. The presence of military individuals in an act does not necessarily make it a coup. Coup is usually, remember, these people were acting in their private capacities. A coup is typically, like I said, it's a prior instituted force of some sort, using the power they're granted in an illegal way. So the difference between, say, a bunch of people who are military showing up in the insurrection and a unit, let's say there's a unit of military folks that as a unit, their captain says, we're going to go do this. They're following the orders of the captain. They arm themselves, and as a unit, they go and do an action. That is using a prior existing authority in an illegal way. That then becomes the basis of a coup. Not just that there's the presence of individuals, but how they're using prior authorities in illegal ways. Mike's asking here, institutional or multiple individuals. It's multiple. Yeah, they come from. He's referring to the Army. I think I mentioned there was something like 15 people who are veterans. Only 2 were Armor Reserve and 4 police. So even then, if you look percentages wise, out of 400 folks, they've had 6 so far that were active reserve and active law enforcement. Jennifer Dotson, I do not watch Reddit, so I haven't seen that video, but then again, I didn't invest in GameStop either. But I'll take a look at that. Yeah, is that the video? I'm almost saying, I just look at the URL. Is that the video where they're doing the exercise? The coup goes rolling behind it. I have seen that video. That has been shared. That was the one, for people who don't know, there was somebody doing a TikTok exercise style video on a major highway doing a jazzercise, and behind them come these. I shouldn't laugh. It's very serious. This is very upsetting for people in Myanmar. It's very unfortunate, but it is somewhat in absurdity. Humor lies. Behind her, as she's doing this jazzercise video, come these military vehicles that are just blocking off the highway, and she just keeps doing the exercise. Yeah, so Lucas is talking about, prior conspiracy. There's all these things about removing of panic buttons, apparent live tweeting of capital evacuations. Those are things that you're going to have to get into and individually investigate. I think they've got to be looked at very carefully. Because the removal of the panic, one of the things that happens in a riot like this, you have 1,000 people, like, how do they know where XYZ location was? I call it the ant effect, right? You put 1,000 people into the Capitol, they're going to spread out and find everywhere. The fact that they get into every little nook and cranny of the Capitol could be a factor of 1,000 people spreading out and finding it. It also could be someone intentionally going to a place. Those are the things when it comes to kidnapping, assassination, you have to prove criminal intent. Whereas a riot is just, you're doing it, right? You're there, it's happening. Insurrection, you're there, it's happening. Kidnapping and assassination, they're really going to look for prior evidence. And again, that shouldn't be hard. If someone's planning, you look at the Michigan terror group, right? These people had all sorts of plans of what they're going to do in a house. So all you need to do is you get someone who's a witness, some sort of evidence. You need some evidence that there was an intentional conspiracy to do this. And then they're going to throw the book at them. I think that'll come out in the investigation if it does. Yeah, so let's, we're way behind on time, but it's been a good discussion. I'm going to try and get through this. We may have to do a pause here, but let's keep going to, what are we talking about next? Next is going to be, all right, structure of radicalization leading to January 6th. I want to get to this because this is fun. This is loop-de-loop fun, and if it goes long, it's long. These are important issues. We only have an insurrection every 60 years in the U.S. Might as well get it for what it's worth. So time to go to the loop machine. So for those who don't know, I study system science, and I use that system science, specifically system dynamics. It's the study of complex systems, and I specifically use it in violence and instability. So my dissertation is on the life cycle of non-state actors and violent action. So for those who have seen my prior work, I did a lot of research on ISIS, which is more the insurgency and emerging state actor. But my part of the dissertation I'm finishing up now is radicalization leading to violent acts. So I just so happen to have here, before the show started, we put together, I happen to have a fairly good structure of how radicalization works. And I wanted to talk about how this plays into the January 6th radicalization. And I'll try and keep it quick because we're going long here, but I think it's worthwhile. So this, by the way, these structures, don't worry about all the little plus and minus sizes. There's a lot of technical detail in here. These are feedback loop structures, but this is the system structure, and I'll try and narrate as we go through. what happens when radicalization occurs? First of all, we start in the governed and near space. For January 6th, we're talking about the United States. Near space is every town and area. These are the governed spaces, right? We always start with perceived, there's a societal activity or societal response, but the perceived grievance. I want you to focus here. The perceived grievance and moral outrage is the basis of nearly every radicalization that doesn't intersect with criminal insanity. And these grievances can be legitimate, right? This is not to say that every time, first of all, not all radicalizations are bad. Not all radicalizations are violent. We'll get into where that splits off, but it always begins with a grievance. And the grievance can be one that is personally felt, personally resonant. It's happened to me, my friends, my coworkers, my family, or it could be something called vicarious humiliation. Vicarious humiliation is where you see something happening or you think something is happening and you experience moral outrage on behalf of that, even though it is not affecting you. And there's a lot of things that in modern society, social media is great for experiencing vicarious humiliation, right? We see these things and we get outraged, even though they're not affecting us. They trigger these neurological adaptations that drive us to view that as a grievance and have moral outrage. But then the key thing is the narrative. The narrative is how we explain this grievance. What's going on? How did this happen? Who caused this to happen? And there are valid narratives, but when we talk about radicalization, we're talking about a conspiracy narrative. So the January 6th insurrection, you know, you can go back to QAnon and you can get in there, but let's keep it simple. Let's say the perceived grievance and moral outrage is Trump didn't win. And because Trump didn't win, we feel like we're not being listened to. You can go into all the grievances that are legitimate grievances of working white America, things like that. You can go into illegitimate grievances like white supremacy, stuff like that. I don't want to go down there because we got a lot to cover. There's a grievance, but he doesn't win, so they now have a grievance. The narrative now is what comes out after the election. The election was stolen. It was fraud. These are the people who did it. Here's the massive evidence. This is the key thing for radicalization, is there's got to be a conspiracy narrative that provides context of both how the grievance came to happen and who is responsible for it continuing to happen. This narrative then feeds into a fixation. You know, you can read a news report and go, oh, that's bad, and 2 weeks later, you're not even paying attention to it. Fixation means that you are living this narrative 24/7. You're reading news articles, you're studying case files, you're following every YouTube podcast of you're following all the tweets, Rudy Giuliani, all these folks, you're fixated on it. You can't get enough of this information, and this begins to absorb your life. So this conspiracy narrative, you become fixated on it. And then from that fixation, you get an identification or activation. And this identity for violent radicalization is an identity of the warrior. And these identities change. I mean, a radicalization that's nonviolent may have an identity of go out and be a civil reformer, go out and get involved in your community, go out and protest, right? These are all identities that can be activated, but with violent radicalization that I study, the identification is called the warrior mentality, the warrior identity. This is not the same as the military warrior value. It's also known as the pseudo commando, the person who wants to be the warrior who hasn't earned it, right? They want the easy way to feel like they're being the hero in their own story. They're going to do what society needs them to do, but can't ask them to do. They're willing to do it for the benefit of everyone. This identification is fed by this fixation of there's wrong going on. The narrative tells me who's doing it wrong, but no one's fixing it. I've got to do it myself. I've got to take it upon myself. And that leads to a pathway to violence. And that leads to terrorism. And that leads to societal response. So you got one feedback loop growing here. Inside that loop are the network effects that go on. So you have moderating network effects are in red, radicalizing are in green, and this is an interplay that actually is a tug and play between these network effects. And this is what limits radicalization growth. This is why not everyone becomes radicalized, because they're generally surrounded by more moderate people that have a moderating influence on them. But what's going on, and by the way, these are fed by cultural scripts. A cultural script could be, it's an abstract symbolic content. It can be delivered on any medium. It could be a meme. It could be a tweet. It could be a newspaper article. It delivers the information that drives this radicalization. So let's dive in real quick to what that network effects looks like. So now we dove into that radicalizing and moderating network, and we're going to do the same thing and kind of blitz through here. This is that rate of activation that was at the center. The rate of activation is determined by the prevalence of radicalized views in your network. So the more radicalized people you have in your network, the more radicalized you become. as one of the interesting things, these dynamics happen. As people get radicalized, they self-select to see more, that fixation. They want to see more radical content. They want to see more extreme content. People who self-select begin following radical posters. They begin to lose those other voices, and they begin crossing over. There's this, they call it incestuous or promiscuous crossover between social groups that, and you see this in Facebook group, like I'm part of this Facebook group that is very, very pro-Trump or very, very pro Bernie Sanders. And you don't see crossover between them as much, but you see lots of crossover between Bernie Sanders and AOC and between Trump and other supporters in the community. You know, so these crossover between radical groups begin reinforcing this kind of broader ecosystem. And you get this clustering effect where divergent conspiracy theories or radical groups that were separate, anti-vaxxers, QAnon, all this stuff begins to coalesce into clustering. And the clustering creates mutual group reinforcement, right? And that's because they have the illusion of numbers. So if you're in one of these networks, you're fixated on it, you're looking at it, and everyone's agreeing with you. There's very few people that are, you know, if you're moderate, you've selected out of this group. You don't want to see it anymore. So what people see is this illusion of radical number, the illusion of large numbers. Everyone believes with me. How can no one understand it? Everyone I talk to, everyone I see, it's got to be those other folks out there that don't get it. Two other things come up from this radical group density effect is there's the interactive echo chambers, right, which makes sense. The more radical group reinforcement we have, we isolate people from the moderate context, we reduce the exposure to moderate counter narratives, and that increases the self-selection. And up here in the radical group reinforcement, abandonment of radical this factor called radical group cohesion. The more coherent your group is, the less likely people are to abandon the radical. So as this goes on, people not only become fixated, they become more cemented to this radical view, which reduces the abandonment. Now, this is a symmetrical structure. So the opposite side of this is the same thing on the moderate, right? And moderating here is not political moderate, just means non-radical. On the moderating side, they're self-selecting out. The radicals don't want to see that. So you have this symmetrical opposed system structure that is playing back and forth all within this larger one, and it can reduce through the magic of system dynamics. It reduces into the simple diagram at the center of the larger radical. So that entire thing I just showed you reduces and simplifies to this contest here between the radicalization networks and the moderating networks. Now, ungoverned far space. So when we talk about war on terror, the far space is Afghanistan, it's Syria, it's areas overseas where non-state actors operate with impunity. But the ungoverned space is conceptual. It means that the government has limited ability to intervene and control that. So ungoverned space might be 4chan, 8chan, Parler, Reddit, parts of Facebook groups, areas where the government is not able to get into as much. And what's occurring in this far space is they are providing these radical non-state actors, the groups that are behind this. Now, I'm doing this from the standpoint of looking at predatory mass violence and terrorism. So in this case, a non-state actor might be ISIS, but a non-state actor might be the QAnon groups on 4chan, right? That's a non-state actor. What they're doing is they're spamming these cultural scripts through two methods, broadcasting and narrowcasting. These cultural scripts are what give people, this is how they receive the information to know, what should I be upset and angry about? What's the narrative I should take from this? And you got to feed me this fixation. Now, the difference between broadcasting and narrowcasting is like, broadcasting is like a news network, Fox News, CNN, Legal Eagle, that's broadcasting. Well, Legal Eagle is a little different. It's a mass media type thing. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, these are all mass media. It's broadcasting, it's giving general. Narrowcasting is when an individual, even if they're communicating with a lot of people, creates a personal connection. This is why Legal Eagle is a little bit different, because you're dealing with that one YouTube influencer you're dealing with personal. Tweets, the president is narrowcasting. When he tweets, people receive that as a personal communication. And so broadcasting is sort of setting the stage. It's creating the conditions and doing this. But the narrowcasting of cultural scripts begins to form this. I mean, when you're looking at this for overseas terrorism, you have mujahideen or jihadi that are operating and fighting in the fight, sending videos. Here I am on the combat lines. You too could do this. It's a very personal connection. Likewise in these elections. So when these election stories, election fraud, you had broadcasting of fraudulent information going out from the major OAN, Fox News, Newsmax, things like that. But you also had narrowcasting. Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood, Rudy Giuliani when he wasn't melting on stage, President Trump. These are people who get followed, and Facebook influencers, YouTube influencers, these parlor folks. All of these people are creating narrowcasting connections. And these are it's that personalized narrowcasting that creates almost an idolized celebrity worship. I want to be on their side. I want to be like them. Look at them. They're going to do this fight. And I'm using the election context here, but this radicalization can happen in all sorts of things. And they're setting the tone for what is the identification, right? If Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood are like, election fraud is bad, go out and register to vote and vote, Georgia would be red right now in the Senate, right? Their identification they had is the whole thing's rigged. You should abandon it, not participate, and you need to fight because it's going to go away. They're narrowcasting this warrior identity standpoint, which I think fed into the January 6th and still is feeding into the risk of this. So these broadcast and narrowcasts are just flooding the zone with cultural scripts. And then the rest of this, just to complete this out, your societal response. So if you respond badly, your societal response can create radicalizing cultural scripts into radical non-state actors. If we had, the response of cutting off Twitter and Parler and Amazon, that can create radicalizing cultural scripts that the non-state actors pick up on. They're censoring us. None of this is right or wrong or truthful or factual. It's just showing the flow of information. Likewise, if you have a major terrorist incident and you unduly persecute some group, that's going to radicalize people. You can have a societal response also sparks an intervention to break into the safe haven, to intervene and remove the safe haven. And of course, when you do that overseas and even in areas, that spawns the accidental guerrilla effect, which I've talked about before, creating a conflict zone. And ironically, conflict zones are a great place to narrowcast from because as humans, we love conflicts. We like to see the daily conflict. And that leads to some specific ones here that are more appropriate, I think, to foreign non-state actors. But you have the radicals from the near space travel between the near and the far space. They go to the conflict zone and then they come back, and they come back experienced. Now, that makes more sense when you're talking about Afghanistan, but it also applies here because think about this. The conflict zone for at least 4 hours on January 6th was the Capitol Hill. And you had a lot of people from different near spaces travel to the conflict zone, participate. They narrowcasted while they were in the insurrection, right? This narrowcasting, I'm here, look at me, I'm in the Capitol. This is incredibly powerful stuff. It's driving the fixation and the identification, and then they return to the near space having had that experience. They have increased cachet in their groups. Again, this depends on that 17% effect. A lot of them got ratted out because they weren't as supported as they thought they would be, but they're still doing this powerful narrowcasting on the way. So let's see what there's questions here so far. Structure, yes. Finishing up, good. Yep, Canada declares Proud Boys. As I said, Canada free speech laws are very different. Lucas talk of fixation. Lucas, fixation, in radicalization terms, we talk about fixation to the extent it impedes other important aspects of your life. I'm not going to call you out. I'm not here to judge, but fixation isn't necessarily just spending a lot of time on something. It's how much it pulls away from other needed facets of your life. So when people become, and remember, a lot of people get into the grievance, they get the narrative, and then they stop. They don't have time for the fixation. They don't have time for it. They may have an ideological belief. They're not going to get radicalized because they're not fixating. They're not adopting identity. They just believe, yeah, the election was rigged, but I'm going to go on doing what I do. These people are not radicalized. The radicalized ones are the ones who go through the full loop and take an act on it. Right, and Laura's given a great example here. When this now my research is on violent radicalization. So for purposes of dissertation and peer review, I'm not saying this has anything to do with any other radicalization, but I think it does. Laura's giving a good example here. Identification and radicalization. The nonviolent response is the increase in law students focused on immigration law and became immigration attorneys after the family separation. So radicalization, this is very important. Radicalization itself is not bad. Nonviolent radicalization is not bad. It can lead to many good things, and it's important. So I think there needs to be distinctions. Violent radicalization is a little bit different. Brendan, for those of you who see themselves in this, I've been seeing this in you for years now as I study this. I'm letting people live their lives. I'm not calling it anywhere non-purpose. Brendan's asking if you can get PowerPoint for non-utilization reasons. Brendan, you can get my dissertation when it's published. Jennifer, yes, I am narrowcasting. Those, I have an identity. So this is a good point. Jennifer Dotson asked, am I narrowcasting right now? The answer is yes. I have established a brand identity. I am the infomullet guy. I am the one who gives you more context. I got a flavorful, fun-loving, partially psychopathic former special forces emotional support donkey next to me. This story of narrowcasting creates connection. It creates personal connection. And if I were using this for nefarious purposes, I could be sending you cultural scripts that fixate you and, you know, have you do identity. Now, I don't have the time in the world to get you fixated on anything, but you know, I don't have that time to put it out. Identity-wise, I want you to become a muleteer, right? I'm trying to get you to do something. So you can see there are varying degrees in this in everything we do. But when we talk about radicalization, keep in mind, we're talking about fairly extreme manifestations of this behavior. It's not just, hey, I watch a thing here and there, or even I watch, you know, a news channel every night. I like Rachel Maddow or I like Sean Hannity. It's the entire loop taken to an extreme extent. Oh, look, let's see if I can. There was a scammer, and the scammer is gone now. Hope people, oop. So the scammer generated a lot. Yeah, I'm big enough to make the scammer. So, psychopathic prior special forces emotional support donkey. Jeff, it's a very exclusive LinkedIn profile. I'm telling you, there's a very small group that fits that criteria. So let's shift from radicalization and the trauma of the insurrection and angst and fury and all that, and just go over to GameStop, which is a happy, fun-loving story as I round out this, get to the bottom half of what I want to talk about. So GameStop, this I'm going to have to refer to my notes because this gets, so media literacy on GameStop. First of all, if you like this content, activate yourself as a radical and become a Patreon supporter, right? I'm narrowcasting, damn it. I'm going to activate you, your identity. You want to be a muleteer or a senior muleteer, you know, go out www.patreon.com/infomullet, become a muleteer subscriber. Yeah, there you go. So I suck at radicalization. That's just the bottom line. If you like, and I say again, we've got the large mega mullet just came out for Russia. It's on the blog now. The mega mullet on the impeachment and trial is coming up. That'll come out this weekend. And I'm doing a poll. If you're an actual muleteer right now, go on to Patreon, participate in the poll. Tell me when you want the special episode that's all about the impeachment and insurrection charge, specifically about Trump. We've kind of touched on it, but I dive deep into that one. So media literacy GameStop. There's going to be, first, there's so much confusion about the stock market that I just want to do a brief educational thing, right? Very simplified. And this is done by the standard caveat that I don't know why people do, but maybe there's a law. I'm not a financial advisor. I got a fucking stuffed donkey next to me. I don't have a bandana on my head. I'm not on Reddit. Don't take my advice literally. Do your own homework, blah, blah, blah. Void where prohibited, no batteries included. So how does this whole thing work, right? So let's start from the beginning. When you buy a stock, generally price goes up a little. When you sell a stock, price goes down, okay? All clear so far. Longs are people who buy a stock hoping the price will go up so they can sell it at a higher price. If you buy it at $20, you sell it at $30, you pocket $10. That is a long. It's what most people think of stock buying, right? I bought a share, I hold on to it for some length of time, I hope it goes up. Let's not even get into stored value and whether ownership or all that. We're keeping it simple here, very simple. Buy stock at 20, stock goes to 30, sell stock, make $10. A short is the mirror inverse of a long. So a long buys a stock at a price, waits a period of time, and sells it at the higher price. A short starts by selling a stock and then later buying it, hopefully at a lower price. Now, how this works, just take it on my word that it does. There's a lot of financial history in here and a lot of abstraction, but you're basically borrowing a share from someone and saying, sell it to me at 20 bucks, right? I will buy it then at $10. And that means that if you, the $10 difference, when it goes down in price, you make the difference. The purpose of a short is to make money when the stock value goes down. So here's the deal with a short. if in a short position, if you bought it at 10, or excuse me, you had it sold to you, you sell it at 20 and you buy it at 10, you make 10 bucks. Because remember, you start with a sale, and this is why it gets tricky. But if you're a short and you sell it at 20 and the stock then goes up to 30, you've lost 10. So this is the key difference between long and shorts. Long want the stock to go up because they make money. Shorts want the stock to go down. Now, all of these things can be done as margins. A margin is when you're using only a fraction of the total funds to basically purchase. It's basically you're using 25 to 30%, and that way you can leverage the money. If you have $100 and you want to use a margin account, you can go long, you can go short, and you can do it more than you have the actual means to. And there's rules, all sorts of rules about how much of your account can be margined, how much money you have to put down. The key thing is shorts are always required by FINRA regulation to have 25% of the value of their shorts in the account. This is important. It will come in later. The next three concepts are all various market phenomena that happen out there, right? One's called a pump and dump. A pump and dump is when someone has a lot of shares, they increase hype, so a lot of people buy those shares. And as those shares go up in price, because remember, as you buy a share, it goes up. As lots of people buy the shares, they sell the shares they have into that rise. They want to make that difference between their buy and their sell, so they hype it up. It's called a pump and dump. Because remember, when you sell a share, price goes down. So, and this all works out in little micro fractions, millions of times a second. But just a pump and dump is an actual maneuver where someone hypes the stock to sell it, and then it goes down. When they sell a bunch, and the people who bought it at the higher price are now underwater because they bought it at say 30 and it's dropped down to 25. Now you don't realize any losses in a long until you sell the stock. You're just, it's paper loss. The short squeeze is different. A short squeeze is when you've gone short and everyone else is buying the stock, so it goes up. Because remember, on a short you lose money as it goes up. And because you have to keep 25% of the value of your short position in the account at any time, I think that's the number, right? If you bought a stock at 20 and it goes up to 30 bucks, you may have to put a couple more bucks in. If it goes up to 50 bucks, you got to put more money in. There's no limit to the amount of pain you can have. And a short squeeze happens is as the shorts have to put more and more money in, they may say, screw it, I'm out, I'm going to close the position, and they take the loss. To close a short means that you buy a stock, right? So remember, you started out by selling the stock, and you end it by buying. So it's the reverse of the normal. When you close that short position and buy a stock, it has the effect of pushing the stock up. So every other short just got screwed by a little bit more. And what a short squeeze is when a whole bunch of people experience an enormous amount of pain that their shorts are underwater, that they are forced to close their accounts. And that causes more buying to happen, which drives the price up even more, putting more pain on the remaining shorts. So it becomes this feedback effect. Now, a dead cat bounce, great name. A dead cat bounce often happens as part of either a pump and dump or a short squeeze. And that is when a stock price is falling dramatically. And then it has a sharp rise, like it looks like it's recovering. But what's happening is as the price is falling, remember, short positions, they clear out their short position by buying it. And for them, if the money's gone down from where they had it originally, they want to realize those profits. They'll buy those shares to close the position, and buying moves the stocks up. So a dead cat bounce is when shorts begin clearing their position. It will drive the price up, but only as long as they're clearing the positions, and then the price will drop back down. So it has a dead cat bounce. Now, some of this, there are lots of guardrails in the system. And the guardrails, think of this as, and this gets into GameStop, right? Well, let's talk about the guardrails. The guardrails to keep, there are volatility breakers. Trading halts can be held at any time if there's a certain amount of volatility. These FINRA requirements for deposits and funds on hand. The brokerages themselves have to keep certain amounts of funds on hand. And the reason why is we often think that once we buy a share, that is ours in our pocket right now, and we bought it from somebody out there and there's like an immediate transfer. Doesn't work that way. Specific to GameStop, what happened is there was it's a crappy company. No one thinks it's a good company. It had a large short position, up to 100%. Some people say more than 100%. So this is something that if you wanted to do a short squeeze, you could really engineer it quickly. And there was a group on Reddit called Wall Street Bets that got a swarm effect. They got together and started buying GameStop. Now, GameStop is a horrible stock, but they bought it intentionally to create the short squeeze. This was a strategy that I call of like, it's like letting toddlers run in the freeway to be hit by trucks for the purpose of taking the truck out, or climbing into a kamikaze plane. No one normally would buy a stock as poorly as GameStop because it's long-term prospects. But if you specifically want to hurt a hedge fund, and you're targeting a hedge fund, and you know these hedge funds are very exposed, you go in knowing you're going to lose the money you do. And what happens is, because you buy it, the price goes up. Now the hedge funds are feeling that pain. They've got to bring in the billions of dollars to fill up their account, or they've got to close their position. If they close the position, it puts more pain on the other hedge funds. You get a short squeeze. So last week, what happened with GameStop is it all came together in about 4 days, and it continued through to this week. There was a massive short squeeze that these several hedge funds lost, I think, 20 to 30 billion dollars in a matter of days, because this stock that no one thought was any good was specifically targeted not to buy it on value or to hold it, but to specifically engineer pain for the hedge funds. And it caused that. It literally caused the pain. Now, some people have said hedge funds have been bankrupted. I don't think they've been bankrupted. Certainly, they've been hurt. And if you're a hedge fund, if you're hurt, you don't want to say you're bankrupt until the last possible minute, so we can see that come out. But the problem that happens, and where a lot of this kind of got confusing is, I mean, if it wasn't confusing already, is the trading brokerage where most of this activity was taking place on. Robinhood on Thursday put in limits on how trades were done. Now, Robinhood is not a traditional brokerage. It doesn't charge any fees. And most of the accounts on Robinhood are margin accounts. Remember, I said margin accounts are where you don't have to have as much money as what you're actually spending. Margin accounts have very specific requirements, and Robinhood encourages people to put in and upgrade and get these margin accounts. It encourages that. They also make money by selling your trading information out to people who are using it in market flow to identify patterns. One of these is Citadel. One of the ones who's been targeted is like, hey, they got all this information, maybe they had a hand. But there is a very complicated plumbing involved when you have a margin account and these shares are going back and forth. Now, there's a Twitter thread down there, and this gets into the plumbing in detail. But if you think about this, for every transaction, it's not me selling buying a share of stock from one person. There's actually 4 to 5 parties involved, and it takes place over 2 days. So there's the buyer of the stock, me. There's Robinhood that I'm trading at, and there's a clearinghouse called DTCC, and then there's the seller's brokerage and the seller's account. So what happens is, as I put in a buy order, Robinhood passes that on to DTCC, who finds a seller's brokerage, they find a sell. All of these things match up. To me, it looks like I bought a share. But what's going on behind the scenes is there's all of this settling that has to happen. And it takes about 2 days, 1 to 2 days. And it actually, anytime that money is moving around, but actual property hasn't changed hand, there's risk, there's counterparty risk. And that's normally no biggie. But when you're a bargain basement budget platform like Robinhood, you've got no traditional fees, that counterparty risk can require you to put in a lot of money very quickly when the price goes way up. Normally what they do to manage this is they do hedges themselves. So everything I just described can get more complicated, which is a put and a call. A put is an option to buy, a call is an option to short. And think of these as just option that at some point in the future, you agree to sell me a stock, or you agree to let me buy a stock at a certain price. That's an option. Now, on stocks that are worthless, these options are very cheap. Think of these like planes. Think of the shares like planes, right? You got 4 or 5 parties. I buy a plane, and until the plane gets in my account, there's money going back and forth. There's risk, there's counterparty risk. Those require funds to make sure that it all settles well. And a lot of the regulations that were passed in the wake of the 2008 financial calamity and the flash crash were designed to protect retail investors from volatility. That way, if there's a major price spike, they don't have to eat it. But that risk increases as volatility spikes up to unusual amounts, and it increases when the normal operating rules of the market aren't being followed. So think of this. If I buy a plane and the value of the plane is worthless, no one values the plane as much, it's a couple cents, then it trades very cheaply. But if all of a sudden there's a run on kamikaze planes, right? Everyone's running out to get their kamikaze plane. All of a sudden, the cost of kamikaze planes goes way up, simply because a lot of people want to get in a kamikaze plane and run into that hedge fund. So now kamikaze planes, supply and demand. Kamikaze planes get expensive, and there's the correlation that you would normally use to hedge the kamikaze plane, or that you would use to hedge your planes, is gone. The example is Normally, when a put, an option to buy a stock that is out of the money, that means that the agreement is worthless. It's paper, it's worthless. The expiration's coming up, and the price to buy it is outside of, it's not worth anything. It's at that point, it's trash. Usually those are valued at pennies. But because there are a lot of people looking to buy kamikaze planes from Reddit suddenly, that now one option might be worth 19 bucks. And it flips this whole thing where the money that Robinhood would have and they'd be able to allocate evaporates. And all of a sudden they've got extremely high volatility, extremely high funding amounts. They've got to put in the funding pieces and fund that to ensure the counterparty risk. All of this causes them to put the limits on the buys, which occurred on Thursday. Now, this is key. This is Robinhood and a few other trading firms did it well, but this is not the entire market. There was plenty of trading going on in these stocks throughout, and I'll show in a second here how that happened. But Robinhood, no one anticipates. This is the cool thing about Reddit, and to me, the free market. No one, from Senator Warren being smart and building the regulations to the FINRA or the FIRE Act or all these other, no one thought, when they build guardrails on the freeway, they don't think someone's going to take a strategy of running toddlers in front of the bus to slow the bus down. They don't think people are going to get a kamikaze plane and go hit the hedge fund. That's what happened. I think it's a valid market tactic. It's a free market, but the regulations aren't built to accommodate that. And what we saw happen Thursday, Friday is the seizure go up in Robinhood that put this halt on buying. It didn't halt selling, but it put a halt on buying. And the reason why is the guardrails worked. You put guardrails on the freeway so a toddler doesn't get on in front of the truck. There is no contingency in which someone can say, well, this toddler's okay. Let's put him in front of the truck. Let's throw him out there. But that's what people were doing. They're saying, I want to buy a stock that is effectively worse than worthless, and the reason I want to buy it isn't reflected in any of these regulations. And it worked up the whole system and created this cascading effects, which is very easy. Now, if you were following me on Facebook, I was interested on Thursday. I was concerned on Friday, or I was interested on Wednesday. I was very concerned on Thursday. And by Friday, I said, if you're buying into this stock, you're getting played for a pump and dump, which is, yeah. So I'm seeing, let's see here. Let's go through the questions before I go to the numbers here. Yep, and let's see, long, okay, people are going through discussing longs. The Corps taught me entirely definition of pump and dump. Yeah, Marine Corps have a definition of pump and dump. So Jeff's talking about the 140% float, meaning there were 40% more stocks in their actual stocks. Jeff, key point on that number. Talking to people who work in this industry and the regulators, that number is only reported twice a month, at the 1st and like the 20th of the month. In the meantime, and this gets into really detailed plumbing more than I just did, if insiders are selling their shares, those shares are not accounted for in the denominator that makes up the float percentage. So you could have 100% short float that isn't a naked short illegal based off the insiders selling their shares because you've added to the overall value, and you won't know that until these numbers get published. Now, there's some people who say, well, I can see the inside numbers. I'm not going to get in that level, but there are scenarios where you may have 100 and X% of the seeming shares out there, not because they're naked shorting, but because insiders have been selling it. Now, why would insiders sell? If I'm a GameStop insider, why would I sell my shares? I might sell my shares if somewhere along the way, a bunch of people on Reddit drove the value up of GameStop, which was trading in a very narrow range of like $8 to $20 for a long time, they started driving up in value. I haven't been able to unload my shares in a long time. I may start selling it as an insider. And all of a sudden, you've got a scenario where the shares they're selling add to the market cap now of available shares, can be used as float, will report a percentage that's over 100%, but it won't rationalize until that next reporting. We'll find out. There'll be an investigation. They'll find out if there really was naked short. And if there were naked shorts, people need to go to jail. That's pretty clear. We'll find out. This thing's got enough spotlights on. We'll know for sure, but it may take a week or two. And so people are making their comments. Yeah, so Mark is talking about the legal culpabilities of Redditors, Robin. So let's go to the charts. Let's pretend Kramer, I'm not going to be able to do justice to Kramer here, but let's go to, here we go. We'll go to the charts and show what happened here as this played out over GameStop. So I can go through and walk this. So this is GameStop over the last, so if we zoom out, right, this is over 3 months. You can see this trading range here. This is just to clear the chart. These are days at the bottom. You can see December going into January 2021. The line is the share value. And then these columns are the buy and sell interest. Green means there's a higher buy interest than there is a sell. Red means there's a sell. It tells you kind of which way it's going or where the volume, and this is the volume of shares. So you see here that even back in December, here we go. Let's go back several months, right? So here's the start of 2020. There's a weird spike there. You go through, it's very flat. And then beginning in September, it starts gradually going up. It comes up, it was at $4 or $5. And then between September and it has a little spike here. It's now raising up light about, so it's almost quadrupled. And this is the scenario, Jeff, I was talking about. If you're an insider and you watch us and you're sitting on a lot of shares, you may start selling in here, which may create that float number that's 140%. I'm not saying it is. There needs to be an investigation. They'll figure it out. But there is a plausible reason that's not naked short, which will end up burning a bunch of people who bet that it was a naked short. So let's zoom in now to the specific here. This is getting into the last couple days here of January. So this is the 14th of January. You can see here it's moved up. Oop. I've taxed CNBC to the point. Yeah, too many people are trading GameStop. I'm not able to bring it up. So pause for load. This is the problem. You never want to work with live animals or stocks. Yes, I want to. Ad blocker. There we go. Okay, so hopefully we'll see this. So zoom in. Here we go. You can tell I don't have any actual expensive trading tools. I would never be able to meet a deep value. Okay, so here's the rise of the last couple of days. This is where you have this gathering accumulation. The short squeeze I talked about happened right here. This is the short squeeze. This is when the pain, it literally occurs over several days. This is a parabolic curve, perfect exponential. This is when the hedge funds lose all that money. This is when Robinhood puts the brakes on, and you can see here the 28th, and then it goes back up, because remember, other companies are selling throughout this, and you can see the volume is decreasing a little bit here, partly because it goes into the weekend, but you can still see there's way more volume than there normally is. Normal volume's down here. Let's see, that's 14 million, and up here in the short squeeze, it's billions of shares traded, it looks like, or 17 million, some insane number. Then it drops like a rock. So Friday, I put my warning out on Friday. It was at 300 to 350 by Friday, depending on when you bought it. And people are still getting into buy. And they're buying the stock thinking the short squeeze is going to go on forever. The problem is during this time here, a bunch of the hedge funds cleared out their positions. So the ones that got hammered, Melvin Capital, those ones, they got clobbered. They had to close their positions. But new shorts came in. And the new short said, wow, this is at 300 bucks. This is going to go down sometime. So they started their short position at 300. And this is when I started to get worried, because people were still saying things like, you know, I know a couple people who did this. They took their money, they walked away, they gave a stab for against the hedge fund. Good for you, nice job. But if you stayed in, you're at risk of a major pump and dump, because the people who are selling need the share prices to stay up to get their exit out. And that's what happened. Is over the weekend, it dropped from 325, it's now down to 100. So if you bought the stock at $300 to $350 on Friday, you've lost $150 or $250 almost, $200 to $250 just in 3 days. And it's, even if you look in here to the 1 day, you can see this dead cat bounce where there's been a couple of, right? So you see here, this is where it drops on a lot on February. It drops here. See how it jumps back up? This is the dead cat bounce that I was talking about. It drops down. It's going down. All of a sudden, the short sellers who bought in at 300, they're saying, I've made $200 a share. I'm out of here. They're gone. They usually close in a couple days. This buying pattern is actually the short sellers clearing out their latest victims. And that's the dead count bounce. And people seeing this may have thought, oh, it's going to recover, go back, and then it drops again. And it's been fighting here and struggling. It's, even if it recovers to 120 or something, it's now a third of what it was. And the reason that we know that this is a bad stock to buy is you can look at these numbers here on these fundamentals here, and you can look at like earnings per share. This stock is making negative $5 per share. So a price to earnings ratio, a simple thing in stocks is price to earnings is how much are you paying for every dollar that you're getting in earnings. If I had a P&E of 30, that means I'm paying $30 per dollar of earnings. But a negative number means I'm spending $25 here, this 24.61. I'm spending $25 of my money to get negative $1 in return. And that obviously makes no sense. Now, people aren't buying this on P&E. They're not buying it on fundamentals. They're buying it to be a kamikaze aimed at these hedge funds. But this is why I was saying that everything got jacked up with Robinhood, because normally these shares would be worth $0. And this is, by the way, this is after $200 of loss. A forward P&E looks at the forward earnings. So the P&E is past earnings. Forward earnings says over the next 12 months, how much are you paying for every dollar of earning you're going to have? And at Friday, this was negative 3,000. That means people buying the shares on Friday afternoon were spending $3,000 for every $1 negative they were getting. This is the definition of a kamikaze plane, or throwing a toddler in front of the bus to hurt the bus, right? Nothing in the regulations we had that Robinhood was acting under would have protected people in the situation, because it was never conceived of that they would do something like this. Now, as a free market fan, you know, short vigilantism is a thing. If there was this concept of bond vigilantes about 2 decades ago, and they kind of faded out over the last decade, bond vigilantes specifically went after bond rates because they thought that it was being exploitive or things like that. They tend to be major markets. But short vigilantism could be a thing, and that's a market strategy. That's if a bunch of people decide shorts are bad, and they're going to find hedge funds that are overexposed, their float rate's too high, they haven't been discreet about what they hold, and tag them. That's a valid arbitrage of market information. I don't have a problem with that. That's fine. My fear is, and I'll get into this in a second, with the mystery Mousektool, is a lot of people are getting into this because of the hype and the FOMO and the fear of missing out. And what I saw from Wednesday to Thursday, and definitely from Thursday to Friday, was a shift. And it was a dangerous shift, where it's bringing people in who didn't understand, and they were being roped in with this kind of narrative that says, hey, strike it at the hedge fund, give a blow to capitalism. And they're spending real money, which they have now lost quite a bit of. And check the, before we get into the Mousektool, I will check the comments one last time. Yep. Yeah, Lucas pointing out human variation and rationality have a loose relationship to one another. Lucas, hold that thought. Brendan admitting here that he bought some, sold some, made a few hundred. And yeah, I mean, you know, Kramer has a great phrase: pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered. You know, get your money, make your money, take it out. But people who are trying to play this for a major win or something, I think got misled by later in the week. And Brendan saying, listen, the toddlers were a necessary sacrifice. That's the thing, is the system was not put in place to allow folks to put toddlers in front of trucks. And let's look into now the mystery Mousektool. And it's going to look familiar here. What was fueling GameStop was a radicalization dynamic, right? So I showed this in the context of the January 6th insurrection, knowing it would come back. I am pretty convinced now that what was going on with GameStop is an exhibit of this radicalization, not in violence, but in terms of nonviolent activity that still comes with some harm. So let's move it down here. Okay, so this is the simplified form of the radicalization. So first of all, perceived grievance and moral outrage, right? Hedge funds are bad. Capitalism sucks. The world is horrible. We don't like stocks. So this is the grievance and the moral outrage. The conspiracy narrative is the hedge funds are overexposed. They're committing illegal acts. Robinhood's intentional. I saw a lot of this conspiracy narrative formulating. And I'm not on WSB or Reddit or anything like that, but a lot of the narrative inside there is creating this narrative of why to short squeeze the hedge funds. The narrative is not, and this is key, the narrative is not make a few bucks, have your day, go get some money. It is specifically a narrative of being something larger than yourself that is striking a blow for this perceived grievance and moral outrage. And so it ties into that. Now, fixation. If you're on that Reddit forum a lot and you're getting your regular updates, you may be subject to fixation, because look over here, broadcasting and narrowcasting. Deep fucking value, DFV. This is a guy, bandana wearing guy, who's been long on GameStop for almost 2 years now. He gives daily updates. I have saw people treating him like a celebrity, and like, I can't wait for his next update. He's going to tell us Daddy Elon Musk is another one where the head of Tesla, Musk, is out there tweeting, encouraging people to do this. This is that narrowcasting effect. That narrowcasting is when you identify celebrity figures from wherever they come from and you associate with them and you begin to follow their guidance above and beyond what you might do otherwise. So I think this was a real effect. Again, this isn't terrorism, this isn't insurrection, this isn't violence, but I think the same structure is at work. And there is a concern that there's some, there's anti-Semitism playing in here. A lot of the memes were anti-Semitic. There's a lot of homophobia on the forums that happens. There's a valid debate of whether that's perpetuating broader stereotypes, but specifically looking at the GameStop play, the narrowcasting was coming from the YouTube and followers, as well as people who shared memes on Facebook. We can narrowcast each other. I saw so many people who weren't traditionally in stock markets encouraging other people to buy directly, encouraging other people not to sell, the whole hold the line, don't give in, the invocation of the Lord of the Rings, hold the line, all the memes like that. It goes right back to what we saw in these network effects. Right? Make this simple or simpler. There we go. Right? Radical group cohesion. The more we have mutual group reinforcement, the less we abandon positions. The abandoning position in this case is selling the stock. Memes going out that are hold the line, stay strong, stay with your brothers, stay with your sisters, fight. This is encouraging people not to abandon their position and setting them up for the pump and dump. That's why I'm not sure that this guy DFV is going to end up in jail, but I think he's going to end up in a really hard conversation because, one, he has a financial license. So if he's giving, depending on how he said what he's giving, and he's giving investment advice, he may be in violation of the license. Even if he's hurting himself a lot, he set people up, perhaps unintentionally, for what looks like a pump and dump, right? It looks like the value went up a lot and then it dropped and people were left holding the bag. And it's because there was this massive narrowcasting between these individuals like DFV, but also the meme network on social media, your friends, the people you trust, your fellow broadcasters. They're reinforcing this and it looks like it's all fun and joyful. And that's fine. I mean, most 99.999% of Facebook is completely harmless. But when you start talking about playing a lottery at $300 a pop, that becomes very expensive very quickly. And if I don't really, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. At the end of the day, it's the buyer's responsibility to understand the risk. But there are a lot of people that I've seen trading in this stock who really shouldn't have. And I think they were more reacting to this network effect. Because, this radical group density effect, this explains WSB Reddit's Wall Street bets all entire. Self-selection of viewpoints, crossover from other ones, clustering, mutual groupers, illusion of numbers, right? You go on there and all the messages are, GameStop, GameStop, GameStop. Not necessarily a bad thing. It's just this radicalization dynamic I think is interesting to me in that I think it's much more at play in GameStop than we like to think. And this time it's coming from inside the house. It shows the susceptibility we have to these system structures of radicalization, whether they are QAnon, pandemic conspiracies, and of course, the outcomes of radicalizations are very different. There's a large difference between someone losing a couple $100 or making a couple $100 on GameStop and storming into the Capitol. But the key is they start at the same place. Where they end up, we don't know. They start with a grievance, they start with a narrative, then as the radicalization goes, it goes into fixation, identity formation, and driving an action driven by this narrowcasting and broadcasting. So that was the mystery Mousektool, is the use of the radicalization structure to explain the January 6th insurrection, to help explain the GameStop phenomena, which gives you a little bit more to take away than just my really crappy explanation of how shorts, longs, puts, and calls work. So going back to the questions, yeah, screenshot time, go, go, go. These are cultural scripts. These terms that I see people using, diamond hands to the moon, Stonks Burr. These are cultural scripts. These are the communication of cultural scripts that come out and convey all sorts of things. So Leroy Jenkins, a great cultural script, and talk about a meme that has legs. I mean, that's a long-term one. But these radicalization things that I study, I'm only looking at the violence ones. But I think it's as we go around and be conveyors, or we get a hold of information, we got to be more self-aware of when we're being triggered with our grievance and moral outrage, and ask, is that personal resonance that's being triggered or vicarious humiliation? Are we actually experiencing this, or are we experiencing it on someone else has? Then when someone gives us a narrative, be very critical in that narrative. Is the narrative a plausible explanation of effects that could have bad actors? I'm not saying they are. Or is it a conspiracy narrative that divides into the other, that is the target, and the us? And the us and the othering. The othering is behind almost all violent radicalization. Some group gets othered: the Jews, the gays, the Muslims, the whatever. The othering becomes the effect. And the real risk area here is when we get into fixation and identity. Good radicalization create great effects, but when you get fixated on it, you're over consuming it, you get locked in, you're staying on target, you do not diverge, you don't want to hear alternative viewpoints, and your identity becomes this warrior identity, this pseudo commando. I'm in it for the cause of society, I'm going to strike a blow for freedom, Braveheart, freedom, you know, whatever it is. You got to be careful at that point. And that's the tricky part, is we're all being susceptible, you know, we're all being exposed to this. It's all happening around us. I make it seem simple, so to speak, in these system loops, but it's happening all the time. So just whether it's the January 6th insurrection or GameStop or anything else out there, be careful when it comes to this, that you don't get suckered in. And I know you won't, because you're InfoMullet subscribers, and you are the special ones. You're the special ones who are muleteers. And if you aren't a muleteer, now's your chance to fixate a little more and identify and activate yourself to subscribe to my Patreon. So www.patreon.com/infomullet. You'd think with all the work I do, I could mastermind this radicalization mechanic and I'd have like 10,000 Patreon subscribers, but maybe that's post-dissertation, do that post-defense. So I appreciate everyone that has participated and hung with me. 2 hours is a long time to get through, but we had a lot to hit. And go ahead, if you haven't yet, vote on Patreon for when we do the impeachment special edition, whether that's going to be next week in a special time slot, in the normal, we'll boot the foreign affairs and kick that later, or just do it in the normal slot in March. Go out and vote. Please be careful. COVID-19, we haven't talked about it. It's still a pandemic. It's still, I mentioned to someone that even though it feels like it's going down, it is still 4 to 5 times more daily cases now than there were in fall. So don't let that mental perception trick get you that just because we've turned the corner, it's safe. It's not. Wear a mask if you can. Stay at home if you can. Well, wear a mask. Stay at home if you can. And everyone, be safe, be good, and appreciate all the support. And please take care of yourself. From Bonky and myself, have a good day. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.